Well, welcome to this third Stoic Ontology conference. And our first speaker is Ricardo Salles. Thank you very much, Ricardo, for organizing this wonderful workshop. And well, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much. Well, can you hear me? I hope, yes? Well, here I suppose you can, but I mean the people online. Okay, so if there is any problem, please let me know with the audio. Okay, so in this paper, I question the common view that the Stoics in general were nominalists about universals. By universal, I mean the generic entity supposedly denoted by terms such as the human being, when used as singular terms, for example, in the proposition, the human being is a rational mortal animal. Here, the human being is not meant to refer to a particular human being, as Socrates, in Socrates is Athenian, but to a genus that comprises each and every particular human being, and that is itself both a human being and a rational mortal animal. One form of nominalism that has been associated with Stoicism is what I call mental nominalism, the view that these entities, namely the universals, are nothing but mental constructs, objects that we piece together in our mind by uniting a number of properties into a coherent whole, but that do not exist independently of our mind. In the example above, human being denotes a generic entity built in our mind from the properties of animality, mortality, and rationality. I question the view that the Stoics were mental nominalists by focusing on the case of Zeno. The evidence for thinking that Zeno adopted this form of nominalism is inconclusive. I start from his thesis that universals are concepts, noemata, and that concepts are figments, phantasmata. From there, I argue that the evidence that figments are indeed mental constructs is inconclusive, and therefore that the evidence that Zeno was a mental nominalist is inconclusive too. It is inconclusive because it is consistent in principle with mental realism, the view that figments are not mental constructs at all, but rather mind-independent entities. In particular, the evidence doesn't preclude classifying them as incorporeal somethings, entities that fall under the Stoic highest ontological genus, the T. They could be placed in principle alongside the four so-called canonical incorporeals, void, place, time, and sayables or lecta, which are not mental constructs but entities independent from the mind. So in sections 1 to 3, I analyze the evidence on phantasmata and question the notion that they are mental constructs in connection with three interconnected topics. First, the Stoic thesis that figments are the objects of representations that aren't caused by an external body. Second, the Stoic theory of how we form representations of figments. And third, the place of figments in the divisions of Stoic ontology. In section 4, I examine three specific objections against regarding universals as incorporeals. Two of them are not directly related to the notion of figment. First, Zenonian universals are concepts, noemata, but concepts are objects that, unlike incorporeals, fall outside the highest genus. And second, the Stoic criterion for being something is being a particular. Only particulars are something. In contrast, the third objection concerns phantasmata. Each of the canonical incorporeals entertains a definite and characteristic relation to bodies, but phantasmata, including universals, do not. As I shall argue, these three objections fail because here too the evidence on which they are based is inconclusive. My overall claim is therefore entirely negative. When I say that the evidence we have for Zeno is consistent with mental realism, I intend to say merely consistent. I do not mean that it entails that he was a realist, but just that this is an issue about which we need to suspend judgment. At the end, in section 5, I compare Zeno and Chrysippus and show that the evidence for Chrysippus faces the same problem. So I won't read everything. I will focus on sections sections 1 and 2. No, 1, 2, and 3, and that's it. Okay, so figments and external bodies. As I said, in this section, I explore in depth the thesis that figments are the objects of representations that aren't caused by an external object. I seek to prove that this thesis doesn't necessarily entail that figments are mental constructs. It only secures the conclusion that figments are the intentional object of mental representations that aren't caused by external bodies. And this is consistent with their not being mental constructs at all, but rather mind-independent entities. What are Stoic figments? The ancient sources identify them as the intentional objects of a certain kind of mental representation. One example is Aetius in T1a, it's not T2, it's T1a, who reports that for the Stoics, phantasmata are the intentional objects of imaginations, phantastica. Imaginations are a special kind of mental representation distinct from impressions, phantasiae. So I read Long and Sedley translation. Chrysippus says that these four are all different. An impression is an affection occurring in the soul which reveals itself and its cause. Thus, when through sight we observe something white, the affection is what is engendered in the soul through vision. And it is this affection which enables us to say that there is a white object which activates us. Likewise, when we perceive through touch and smell. The word impression is derived from light, just as light reveals itself and whatever else it includes in its range, so impression reveals itself and its cause. The cause of an impression is an impressor, something white or cold or everything capable of activating the soul. Imagination, fantasticon, is an empty attraction, an affection in the soul which arises from no impressor, as when someone shadow boxes and strikes his hands against thin air. For an impression has some impressor as its object, but imagination has none. A figment is that to which we are attracted in the empty attraction of imagination. It occurs in people who are melancholic and mad. The objects represented in impressions, I'm commenting on the passage now, the objects represented in impressions, phantasiae, are the bodies that cause the impressions. For these are mental representations that reveal their cause, and I take this to mean that the object represented is the body that causes the representation, its impressor. In contrast, imaginations, phantastica, are not caused by an external body. One example of this, also in T1b below, which is a passage I won't read, but the example is already in T1a, is the representation by Orestes of the Furies. The situation at issue here is one where Electra is absent as opposed to a different situation, also envisaged in our sources, such as T1d, where she is presented and Orestes just misrepresents her as the Furies. In the present case, there is no external body that actually causes the representation. In fact, T1a claims that an imagination has no impressor at all. It arises from no impressor, ap udenos phantastou ginomenon, meaning presumably that not that imaginations are mental states that literally lack a cause, which would be strange given that in Stoic physics every bodily state, including mental ones, has a cause, but merely that their cause is not an external body. And yet Orestes' phantastica do have an intentional object that they represent, namely the Furies, which are a figment, a phantasma. As is asserted in T1a, figment is that to which, epho, is that to which we are attracted in the empty attraction of imagination. So figments are the intentional objects of mental representations that aren't caused by external bodies. Now, does this entail that figments are mental constructs? It surely doesn't. It only proves that figments are not the cause of our representations of them, which is fully consistent with the hypothesis that figments are not mental constructs. I should like to argue that in general terms, objects that aren't the cause of our representation of them are not necessarily mental constructs. There are two clear cases of this. One of them is when we form mental representations of sayables, lecta. The other is when we form in a dream the mental representation of an external body, but this body is not the actual cause of the representation. To begin with the representation of lecta, consider the following report from Sextus. For they say, just as the trainer or drill sergeant sometimes takes hold of the body's hands to drill him and to teach him to make certain motions, but sometimes stands at a distance and moves to a certain drill to provide himself as a model for the boy, so too some impressors touch, as it were, and make contact with the commanding faculty, the hegemonikon, to make their printing in it, as do white and black, and body in general, whereas others have a nature like that of the incorporeal sayables, and the commanding faculty is impressed in relation to them, not by them. It is clear from the text that we can form mental representations of lecta. The only proviso is that these entities are not themselves the cause of the representations, insofar as they are incorporeal, and according to Stoic metaphysics, only bodies can be causes. Therefore, if we suppose that Stoic lecta are not mental constructs, which is disputable, but mind-independent entities, then T1C is strong proof that for the Stoics it is possible to form representations of an entity E such that E is not the cause of the representation, but E is not a mental construct. This passage raises two questions that I cannot address extensively or at all in this paper, in this presentation at least, which is, are lecta really mind-independent entities? And what is the cause of our mental representations of them? Well, now consider the case of oniric representations of an external body that is not the cause of the representation. The central passage is a text from Sextus again, dealing with impressions, fantasiae, that are both true and false. So the text, the translation is, true and false impressions are ones like the impression Orestes had of Electra in his madness. Insofar as he had an impression from an existing thing, it was true, for Electra existed. But insofar as he had an impression from a fury, it was false, for there was no fury. So too a dreamer's false and vacuous attraction, when his impression is of Dion, who is alive, is of Dion's actual presence. Sextus lists two quite different examples of true and false impressions. One is an impression of an external body that actually causes the impression, Electra, but that misrepresents the body that causes it. It misrepresents Electra as a fury. It is what T1b this is the passage that I didn't read, a misprinted impression, a fantasia paratypoptike. No? Giving as an example Heracles misrepresenting his own children as being the children of King Eurystheus. But the other example given here is quite different. It is an impression in a dream of an external body, Dion, that is not the cause of the impression. The second example is significant because it shows, as T1C also does, that an impression may represent an entity E such that E is not the cause of the representation, but E is not a mental construct. Here, E is an external body, Dion, something that clearly isn't a mental construct. So to summarize, T1AB evinces that figments are not the cause of the mental states that represent them. And T1CD indicate that it doesn't follow from this that they are mental constructs. In sum, T1AD is no evidence for mental nominalism about figments. Let me conclude with a question. What is the place of universals within the genus of phantasmata? To answer, two distinctions are needed. The only example of figment discussed in T1AB is the Furies, which I take to be a particular entity, a particular group of deities, rather than a class. But some possible examples of generic figments are the cyclops and the centaur, cited in T2a in the next section, which seem to be, which is a passage that I will discuss, which seem to be genera as opposed to particulars. So one division in the class of phantasmata is that between particular figments and generic universal ones. Second, for Zeno, all concepts are figments, and we may hypothesize that for him there are two kinds of concepts, and hence two kinds of universals. Fictional ones, e.g. the centaur, when this is a generic entity, and non-fictional ones, the generic human being. This second distinction is not explicitly drawn in the sources, and it is just a conjecture, but it is in principle consistent with the evidence that links concepts to universals. This evidence is T4AC quoted below. I won't quote these three passages in the talk, but in the long version of the paper, they are there. But we can have a look at them in the discussion if you want. So the three passages, they compare enoemata to Platonic forms, which are universals, and Platonic forms may comprise both forms of real genera and forms of fictional genera. Given these two distinctions, particular versus universal figments and fictional versus non-fictional universals, and considering that real bodies can be classified as figments when they are intentional objects of dreams, we may divide the class of phantasmata into two subclasses, particular and universal, both of which are also divided into fictional and non-fictional. Here, if we can go at the end of the paper, Mayra, in diagram 1, it's right at the end, at the very, very end. Here. So diagram 1, so phantasmata, as I said, are divided into particular and universal, and each of them are divided into fictional and non-fictional. So, okay. Very well. So now I now deal with the Stoic theory of the formation in section 2. There. Gracias, Mayra. I now deal with the Stoic theory of formation of mental representation of figments, and here too I take issue with the claim that figments are mental constructs. As I intend to show, there is no conclusive evidence that the figments themselves, as opposed to our mental representation of them, are such constructs. One key text is Diogenes Laertius in T2a. Of the objects of thought, some are thought by confrontation, some by similarity, some by analogy, some by transposition, some by combination, some by opposition. It is by confrontation that we come to think of sense objects. By similarity, things based on thoughts or something related, like Socrates on the basis of a picture. By analogy, sometimes by magnification, as in the case of Titius and the Cyclops. Sometimes by diminution, as in the case of the pygmy. Also, the idea of the center of the earth arose by analogy on the basis of smaller spheres. By transposition, things like eyes on the chest. By combination, we come to think of the center. By opposition, death. Some things are also considered by transition, such as sayables and place. The idea of something just and good is acquired naturally, that of being without hands, for instance, by privation. So the text offers a classification of the intentional objects of thought, noumena, and an account of how thought, noesis, builds mental representations of these objects. This passage is greatly relevant because it treats phantasmata as a species of noumena. For although the term phantasma is not used, several examples are given of entities that the Stoics would classify as phantasmata. Some noumena that are figments in the present passage are particulars, Titius, and some are universals, such as the Cyclops, the pygmy, eyes on the chest, the centaur. The examples given here of noumena that aren't figments are real particular bodies represented through actual sense perception or by analogy from sense perception, from sense objects, as opposed to dreams, for example. Socrates and the center of the earth fall in this class. Thus, if we go back to the divisions of the class of phantasmata that I proposed earlier in diagram 1, and we construe figments and non-figments as two classes of noumena, we may complement diagram 1 through diagram 2, which is again at the end of the paper, Mayra, at the very end. So diagram 1. So that was diagram 1. This is diagram 2, which is built upon diagram 1. So noumena are divided into not phantasmata and phantasmata into particular and universal, and the rest follows diagram 1. Now, so I go back to page 11. Now, are the figments mentioned in the passage mental constructs? There is no clear indication that they are. In fact, T2A focuses on how noumena are thought and noethe, i.e. how we come to think about them. So the procedures listed in the text seem to be just ways in which we build representations of these intentional objects. This is plain in the case of noumena that aren't figments. So consider the center of the earth, no? To kentrontes ges. No? The text surely doesn't mean that the center of the earth is itself something that I build in my mind by some mental operation. The center of the earth is a noumenon that exists deep inside the earth independently of my mind. What I build is just my representation or noesis of this object. Socrates is also a clear example of this. But if so, then the same must apply to figments. There is no hint in the text that the distinction between representations and their mind-independent intentional object, a distinction clearly implied in the representation of noumena that aren't figments, does not apply to the representation of noumena that are figments. Notice that it would beg the question to claim that T2A presupposes that the distinction only applies to non-figments. In order to substantiate this claim, we would need evidence independent from T2A that this distinction doesn't apply to the representation of noumena that are figments. So T2A is entirely consistent with the realist hypothesis that figments are not mental constructs, but rather entities that are like non-figments, no? Namely mind-independent intentional objects of thought. To complement my argument, let me cite another passage, a central piece of evidence for scholars who argue that Stoic figments are mental constructs. ¿Todo bien? It's a passage from Seneca. I read the translation, which is a translation based on Inwood, Brad Inwood. But some Stoics think that the highest genus is something. Let me append an account of why they think so. They claim that in nature some things are and some are not. Nature includes even those things which are not, but which the mind has access to. For instance, centaurs, giants, and anything else falsely depicted by thought that begins to take on some shape despite lacking substance. In this passage, Seneca describes an ontological theory that he attributes to the Stoics and that may be an early theory that originates with Zeno. The characterization of figments that Seneca associates with this theory is worth discussing. Notice that the plurals centauri and gigantes may refer not to universals but to particular centaurs and giants, e.g. Chiron and Titios. But this is not necessarily the case. They could be a synecdoche that Seneca uses, where Seneca uses particulars to refer to the genus of centaurs or giants. So the passage doesn't necessarily exclude fictional universals, and it doesn't exclude either implicitly or explicitly non-fictional universals such as the generic human being. Now, the point that Seneca does stress in his characterization of figments is that they are all falsely formed by thought, falsa cogitatione formatum. Scholars who contend that such entities are mental constructs base much of their argument in these three Latin words. Now, the Oxford Latin Dictionary lists 7 meanings for the verb formo, and only one of them corresponds to produce, which is the meaning it ought to have in T2F if falsa cogitatione formatum is to express the idea that figments are mental constructs. The mind falsely forms figments in the sense that it produces or builds them, and it does so falsely because it misleads us into thinking that they are real external objects. However, one of the 7 meanings listed in the OLD contradicts this reading. This is to fashion a likeness of, depict, represent. This alternative meaning may be the one at stake in our passage. Figments are falsely depicted by thought. And this is consistent with saying that such entities are not mental constructs at all, but simply the object of certain mental representations. As we said in connection with earlier passages, it would be question-begging simply to assume that in this instance only the former meaning is possible. In order to rule out the latter, some prior reason must be given for thinking that Stoic figments are indeed mental constructs. The sentence "abere aliquam imaginem coepit" literally begins to take on some shape or some image is not entirely clear, but it may fit either reading and therefore it cannot be used to support nominalist interpretations. It may mean that figments are indeed things that are gradually given a certain shape when the mind builds them, but it may also mean that figments gradually appear to the mind in a certain way when the mind builds a representation of them. And this is consistent with saying that figments are not mental constructs at all, but independent objects represented by the mind. Thus, none of the passages examined in the present section lends conclusive support to the nominalist hypothesis that Stoic figments are mental constructs. They are all consistent with the hypothesis that they are mind-independent entities, and therefore consistent, too, with the conjecture that Zenonian universals, a species of figment, are themselves such entities. So the last section that I will read is the third. I now turn to the place of phantasmata in Stoic ontology. I argue that in this case, too, the evidence that figments are purely mental constructs is weak. All we know about their place is consistent with including all phantasmata, both particular and universal, in the class of incorporeals, alongside the 4 canonical incorporeals, void, place, time, and lecta, which are not mental constructs at all, but objective, mind-independent features of reality. So given Zeno's claim that universals are figments, the evidence I discuss in the present section is consistent with classifying Zenonian universals as mind-independent incorporeals. One basic division of the highest genus is between the class of what is and the class of things that are not, but that count as something nonetheless. The former includes only particular bodies, such as Bucephalus, because only such bodies are beings, onta. The other class, in turn, includes incorporeal entities. To illustrate these ideas, I quote 2 especially important passages. In both, it is emphasized that in Stoicism the term is or exist applies only to bodies, while something applies to everything that falls within a broader genus that includes bodies, but also incorporeal entities, illustrated through the 4 canonical incorporeals. So one is a passage from Alexander of Aphrodisias. This is how you could show the impropriety of the Stoics making something the genus to which being belongs. If it is something, it is obviously a being, and if a being, it would receive the definition of being. But they would escape the difficulty by legislating for themselves that being is said only of bodies, for on this ground they say that something is more generic than it, being predicated not only of bodies but also of incorporeals. and the other is a passage from Plutarch. As a matter of fact, they refuse to many important realities the name of being, void, time, place, and the whole class of sayables without exception, which includes everything true. For these, they say, though they aren't beings, are nevertheless something. But they continue to make use of them in their lives and their philosophy as subsistent and existent. Now, figments aren't mentioned in neither of these two passages, but they are referred to in Seneca Epistle 58, 12 to 15, an important source for the divisions of the Stoic highest genus. As I shall argue, these sections are fully consistent with including generic figments and therefore universals in the class of incorporeals. These sections describe two competing conceptions of what is exactly the highest genus and how it is divided. One is the conception that Seneca himself propounds, where the highest genus is what is, quod est, divided into corporeals and incorporeals. The other is an alternative conception according to which the highest genus is not what is, but something higher, more primary, magis principale. This is a conception with which Seneca disagrees, but that he attributes to the Stoics. Who are the Stoics? This has been a matter of controversy, but as I indicate below, they might be the early orthodox proponents of the standard theory in T3a and T3b above. So the passage is this. Well, the first passage that I want to discuss is this, that generic genus, what is, has nothing about itself. It is the principle of things. They fall under it. The Stoics want to place above this a yet further, more primary genus. I will first show that this is reasonable I will first show that it is reasonable to treat the genus I have been discussing as primary, since it contains everything. And then I will discuss the Stoic claim, what is, I divide into these species. Beings are either corporeal or incorporeal. There is no third species. So that's Seneca's own theory. He then proceeds to indicate how his own class of corporeal beings is subdivided and how the different species of this class are themselves subdivided. And then immediately afterwards, he returns to the Stoic conception mentioned in T3c, which I already quoted in the previous section, so I read it again. But some Stoics think that the highest genus is something. Let me append an account of why they think so. They claim that in nature some things are and some aren't. Nature includes even those things which are not, but which the mind has access to. For example, centaurs, giants, and anything else, falsely depicted by thought that begins to take on some shape despite lacking substance. In this conception, as Seneca had pointed out earlier, the what is no longer the highest genus, but a division of it, the other division being what is not. The Stoic conception that Seneca is opposing in these passages may be the standard Stoic division of the highest genus I referred to in T3a and T3b above, as I explained shortly. If so, then the division presented here between what is and what is not may well be the early Stoic division between beings, onta, and entities that lack being but that are something nonetheless, namely the incorporeals, the asomata. And if so, the figments mentioned here would enter the class of incorporeals. In what follows, I defend this possibility against interpretations who claim that the text presupposes a tripartition of the highest genus into bodies, incorporeals, and things that are neither bodies nor incorporeals, and classifies figments in the third class. There is textual evidence in a passage by Alexander that the division of the highest genus into bodies and incorporeals is exhaustive. But if we focus exclusively on Seneca, what are the reasons for supposing that a third class is implied? Advocates of the tripartition offer two reasons. First, they suppose that for the theory reported by Seneca, the class of entities that are, quae sunt, is implicitly divided into bodies and incorporeals. From this assumption, they infer that the class of entities that aren't, and that comprises figments, is a class of some things that are neither bodies nor incorporeals, in opposition to the bipartition that is suggested in T3a and T3b. This inference, however, is not really supported by the text. The incorporeals aren't mentioned in the passage as a subclass of what is. They are alluded to earlier on by Seneca as a subclass of what is, but the theory presented here is different from the theory in T3c, according to Seneca himself. So in T3d, the class of things that are not could simply be the class of incorporeals. And if these were correct, the division between the things that are and things that aren't could be the standard division between bodies and incorporeals in the early theory that posits the something as the highest genus and divides it into two, as in T3a and T3b. In this interpretation, the theory reported in T3d could be the same as the early theory. To be sure, T3d doesn't say that the class of things that are is the class of incorporeals. That are not, sorry. So T3d doesn't say that the class of things that are not is the class of incorporeals. But it doesn't deny it either. So we cannot simply assume that in T3d the incorporeals are a subclass of things that are. The interpretation I propose is at least possible, and if it were right, then figments, which T3d explicitly includes in the class of things that are, would pertain to the class of incorporeals, not to a third class distinct from bodies and from the incorporeals. One question that deserves careful consideration is this. If in T3d the class of things that are not were the class of incorporeals, and the theory reported is indeed a standard theory, why does Seneca use examples of figments to illustrate this class rather than examples of canonical incorporeals such as void or time? I believe there could be I believe that there could be dialectical or even rhetorical reasons. The second reason has to do with the term substantia in T3d. Sadly, notably, has argued that this term refers to hypostasis, subsistence, rather than ousia, substance. So given that hypostasis is a property of incorporeals, and given also that fictional entities are bodies, it follows that in the theory in T3d, which denies that to fictional entities the property of substantia, these entities are something that do not belong either to the class of bodies or to the class of incorporeals, but to a third class of something distinct from bodies and from incorporeals. So I quote sadly, David, who is here present, "It seems then that at least on this version of Stoic metaphysics, subsistence, while correctly attributed to incorporeals like space and time, which are a real and objective part of the world's furniture, is denied to merely fictional entities, which not only are not bodies, but do not so much as subsist." Sadly, could be wrong, however, and substantia could refer not to Stoic hypostasis, but to ousia, as Sadly himself had assumed in an earlier work. And if so, then given that only bodies are ousia, it would follow that the theory reported in T3d, which denies to fictional entities the property of substantia, is at least consistent with the idea that fictional entities are incorporeals. Now, even if substantia in T3d did refer to hypostasis, as Sadly maintains, it still wouldn't follow that in the theory reported figments belong to a third class, for there is evidence that the Stoics didn't always use the term hypostasis to refer specifically to incorporeals. In fact, the distinction between being, einai, and subsist doesn't always match the distinction between bodies and incorporeals. Some sources use the two verbs synonymously, which is in T3b, a passage that I quoted earlier. And some imply that both bodies and incorporeals subsist because both bodies and incorporeals are opposed to things that are non-subsistent and hypostata. So I claim to have shown that if we look at the place of figments in the divisions of Stoic ontology, the evidence is consistent with classifying them, including generic figments, alongside the four incorporeals. This is, of course, relevant for my general argument because these incorporeals are not mental constructs at all, but objective, mind-independent entities. So universals could be mind-independent entities rather than mental constructs. As announced in the introduction, I now turn to specific objection against the idea that universals are incorporeals, but I think I'll leave it here. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Ricardo, for this wonderful paper. And now we can open the Q&A session. So please raise your hand here or in Zoom. Edgar?
Yes, yes. Thanks a lot, Ricardo, for this very stimulating paper. Just wondering, I mean, about, because when you read some of the text and then you say, well, this text is consistent with this position, right? That figments are not mental entities, constructs, but mind-independent object, right? But I mean, but I'm wondering whether this, in the case of some text, is too weak. Because, for example, the first text, T1a, seems to me that there's the difference between fantasia and phantasma, impression and pigment, is drawn, like say, well, both of them are impressions in the mind. They are pathé, right?
You mean fantasia and fantastica?
Yeah, fantastica, sorry.
Yeah.
Yes, things that occur in the mind, right? Things that happen in the mind. And in one case, it says, the text says that there is the impression in the case of fantasia. There is impression, and then there is an object that causes the impression, right? So that's the main thing. But when this is contrasted with imagination,
Yes.
then it says that imagination is an empty attraction,
Yes.
an affection of the soul which arises from no impressor.
Yes.
As when someone shadow boxes and strikes his hands, right? So it seems like the more natural reading of this text is that once where we have an impression and there is no object that causes that impression.
Yes.
But and so in the sense it's empty, and it is empty because there's nothing out there in the world to which it corresponds. So the more natural reading is something like the traditional reading that says that the object is just a figment, and the figment must be a mental entity that doesn't. It's just the intentional object that is in the mind. There's nothing outside the mind that has any relation with my impression, whether it's causal or not. And so this seems to be like more natural reading of the text.
Yes.
So I was wondering what was their philosophical motivation for attributing this view to the Stoics.
Which one?
The one that you say that
The natural or
no, the other one.
the other
The one that you say that figment is mind-independent, abstract object, which is like a kind of Magnonian view of object, right? So the Stoic would be Magnonian in this sense. What would be the philosophical motivation within Stoic philosophy of mind and metaphysics to attribute this view to them, right? Because I was thinking that in this kind of view, which seems to come from Aristotle, in some sense, I mean, his theory of fantasia, I was thinking about, we always thought that their motivation was something similar to Aristotle, like say, well, we can get along with positing mental objects as intentional objects, and that's all We don't need to posit any mind-independent entity to account for this phenomenon. And so that's the first question: what is the philosophical motivation for this view? And the second, how is error possible? I mean,
how what?
Error
Error.
possible. I mean, if we have an impression, and the impression is of a mind-independent object, a mind-independent entity, how is error possible? Because I thought that this was also an explanation of error, right? So I have an impression, but nothing corresponds to that impression, just a mental entity that is the intentional object, and so that's how error comes about. So these are the two questions.
Okay. Well, the second one, error. Well, that's a problem for the natural reading, no? Because if phantasmata are just mental entities, private mental entities that you build in your mind, then there is no way in which we can discuss whether centers are heavy or light or things like that. No, I mean that there is no way in which you could be wrong about what phantasma is like. No? And so, in contrast, if phantasmata are mind-independent objects, then whether or not your representation, no, of it is true is something that we can discuss. No, just like space, for a place, for example, void or lectame. These are mind-independent objects about which we can discuss what they are and where they are, or you know, what's their nature, what's the relation between them and objects and bodies, etc. Okay, so your first question, what's the philosophical motivation? Well, the philosophical motivation is indirect, which is the following, is that for Zeno, universals are concepts and concepts are figments. So what I wanted to show is that for Zeno, universals are not necessarily or not clearly mental constructs. They can be, as far as the evidence shows, they could be mind-independent objects. And so to prove that universals are mind-independent objects, what I do is to argue that phantasmata are mind-independent objects in general, and therefore universals too. So what's the interest of discussing whether universals are mind-independent or not? Well, that's the classic question, no? Yeah.
I was thinking, what was the motivation for thinking that phantasmata in general are mind-independent objects?
Because it's one way of showing that universals are mind-independent objects. I mean, if you say all universals are concepts, all concepts are phantasmata, and all phantasmata are mind-independent, it follows that all universals are mind-independent. So that's one way of not the only one, of course. No? And what I want to say here is that I'm not trying to prove that universals are mind-independent. What I'm trying to say is that the arguments for arguing that they are mind-dependent are not conclusive. And as for passage T1a, no? Well, what the passage shows is that phantastica are not caused by an external object. Yes, that's true. But it doesn't follow from the fact that a mental representation of something it doesn't follow from the fact that my representation of something is not caused by that thing. It doesn't follow from that this thing is a mental construct. Right? I think the clearest example is the Dion example. Dion is a mind-independent object, of course, because he's a person. He is not the cause of my representation of him when I dream about him. And he is not a mental construct. So the Dion example shows how I can represent something that is not the cause of my representation of it, and is not a mental construct. No? So that's my approach to this text. No?
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Lara? Thank you very much. I'm really interested in this topic because I'm writing a book on anomalous experiences of dreams hallucination.
Yes.
This kind of thing. And now I'm really focusing on the problem of dreams in idealism philosophy, but also in the previous rationalist context.
Yes.
And
Oh, interesting.
my question, and it's very important to have in mind these problems in ancient philosophy because they are using the same language, so they also speak about phantasmata. And my question would be, how, if phantasmata are mind-independent intentional objects of thought, then how can we distinguish them from other kinds of mind-independent object of thoughts? Because one way that is taken from non-idealist philosophers, such as Wolff, is to say that in the case
Yes.
of phantasmata in dreams, for instance, you don't have the same order and the same necessary relationships between what happens in the dreams and in your awakened life. And so this is the criteria to distinguish between the two. And I would like to know which kind of criteria to define them.
Just a question. So the criterion in these authors that you are studying, the criterion is the logic. I mean, the causal relations, the order of events, which differs in reality and in dreams, and that's how you know that this is a dream and not a dream. Is that okay?
Like different approaches, but the most common is to say that there is no logical order or sufficient reason to connect the plot of the dream and your awakened life. So maybe the dream is very realistic and you can find some sufficient reason why A is previous to B. Usually no, but they don't exclude the possibility of having very realistic dreams. But still, even in this case, you don't have a necessary relation between the plot and what happens in your awakened life.
Okay. So the original question is how, what the Stoics would say about how to distinguish mind-dependent from mind-independent objects of thought, or
Between phantasmata,
yes,
as they are,
and
as
real
you
objects.
consider them,
Yes,
so are
yes.
mind-independent and other kind of objects.
Yes. Well, that's a very good question. That's a very good question. I think that we would need to go case by case, no? But when I classify, when I show, no, that it is possible to look at phantasmata as a species of incorporeal, then one question would arise: well, what's the difference between a phantasma and the four canonical incorporeals, no? Between place and the center, no? And well, I think that each of the incorporeals has an important role to play in science, for example, or in human practice, no? I have a section on this in the longer version of the paper, but what I argue there is that phantasmata, either fictional or non-fictional, can have an important role in many practices, no? And in definition, for example, no? When you undertake the task of defining things, you are dealing with universals, no? With genera, no? And then, well, these are phantasmata, and so that's how. I mean, so to return to your question, what would be the difference between universals and places or lecta? Well, they are present in different dialectical or scientific practices, no? And one is definition and the other is physics. And no, I think that we would have to go step by step and look at the tree in diagram 1, no? Where I propose a distinction between two kinds of phantasmata, the particular and the universal, and then to look at the division, at the subdivisions of each of these two divisions, and go case by case. No, I mean, what's the role of centaurs, for example, in human practice? No, I mean, well, they can be crucial for literature and myths, no, and I don't know. We would have to look case by case, but my intuition is that for each kind of phantasma, you can assign it a role which is distinct from the role you assign to the other four incorporeals, and then that's the distinction, no? Between phantasmata and the four canonical incorporeals. And as for you, and regarding your question, how do we know we are not dreaming? I'm not sure if the Stoics dealt with that. Maybe Christian knows, but I have the impression that they have something to say about it. But it's I think it has nothing to do with order and logic. No, it's. I think they say that the wise person will never think that a dream is. I mean, they will never think that a dream is real. No, and I mean they will never get it wrong. No, something like that. No, Christian?
It's a possibility.
Yes.
Vanessa?
¿Yo?
Yes, Vanessa.
Okay. Hola, gracias. Okay, thank you. I have a question about the IIFs passage. So, it seems like you're understanding impressors as being bodies.
Yes.
And on the basis of that, arguing, well, it's sure, maybe it's not caused by a body, but that leaves these other things that could be the causes. So one thing is just that I think we shouldn't, this doesn't undo your point, but we shouldn't, I think that impressors are always bodies. There are both sensory and non-sensory impressors. That's something that we can take from the drill sergeant passage.
Yes.
And then there are also sensory and non-sensory impressions.
Yes. But so we should or we shouldn't regard impressions our bodies. We should
I
not.
think no.
No. Okay.
Yeah, and I think that still gets you, I think you can still get that the impressor can be either sensory or non-sensory.
Mm-hmm.
And then my question related to that is just whether, one clarificatory question is whether when you say that things are mental constructs, you're assuming that makes them unreal in some sense. And not part of the ontology, specifically.
Well, yes. When they are mental, saying that something is just a mental construct, well, that's a question I would ask, I would put to people who defend that view. No, I mean, some people seem to say that a mental construct is something that isn't part of the ontology because it's just that. And there is nothing that corresponds in reality to the mental construct. And that's why mental constructs are not part of the ontology. So I think that this is how some people would formulate it. But one of the troubles I have with understanding this position is that a mental construct is something, no? I mean, it's something in your mind. So, I mean, if you prove that something is a mental construct, even if it's just a mental construct, you are proving that it is something. I mean, that it's not nothing, no? I mean, it's nothing in the sense that there is nothing that corresponds to it in reality, outside the mind. But it's still something, no? I don't know. So,
Yeah, well, that is a different question.
It is.
I mean, I definitely think that something can be a mental construct and count as tit or something. But I don't think that just in virtue of having some, mental image that creates a something. So I think we can make a distinction between things that are sort of merely intentional objects and therefore not a part of the ontology, and things that we do invent that could be mental constructs that are nevertheless very real parts of the world that we can all refer to and say true and false things about.
Okay.
So I think that, anyway, that was just a clarificatory question. My last question is just whether, I have to go back and read it again, but my sense is that there may be a running together of the fantasia and the imagination. Because what characterizes a case of imagination is that there's no impressor at all. And that, I think, would count as saying that there's no impressor either corporeal or not corporeal. We can leave that open, what those things are.
Well, may I say something? Well, if one of the things you said, Vanessa, and thank you for your point at the beginning, was that according to you, an impressor doesn't have to be a body. But then one question is, if it's not a body, how can it impress? No, I mean, how can it?
Yeah.
Because in order to impress anything, something must have causal powers, and only bodies have causal powers. So how could something that is not bodily could be an impressor? And the other is, how could you have a mental state, in this case, a fantasticon, that has no impressor at all? I mean, does that mean that it is something that lacks a cause, that is uncaused?
No.
Good.
Yeah, so I think that the point of the drill sergeant passage is to show that there's a causal story to be had, even when the impressor is an incorporeal, like the lecta. And in that case, the agent of the impression is the soul itself, but it is nevertheless being impressed in relation to, or epi, the incorporeal. So I think that's what that whole story is for. And then similarly, where there's no impression at all, it's not a mental event that's completely uncaused. It's being caused by the soul in the manner of a fit of madness. And that, of course, is the very difference between an impression and a case of imagination. An impression, even if it's incorrect, will have an impressor, whether it's bodily or not. And a case of imagination will have no impressor at all, but not therefore be uncaused.
I mean, it has no impressor in the sense that there is no external body that causes it. But it is caused by the soul.
Yeah, right.
Yes.
There's always going to be a causal story to be had, and I think that's true both for the incorporeals, and that's the story we're being given with the case of the drill sergeant. And I think, but in that case, there is an impressor, but the agent, the causal agent is the soul, but there is an impressor, namely the lecton or the pattern of the drill sergeant's motions. And then in the case of the imagination, there's no impressor at all. It's a complete mental fabrication. And that is the piece that I was worried was getting lost, the distinction between impression and imagination, which is that in the case of imagination, there's no impressor at all.
Okay, well, I have to, yeah, I appreciate this distinction that you make, no, and I need to think more about it. I mean, what I was trying to argue is something simpler, no, less sophisticated than what you're presenting. What I just wanted that what I want to say is that when something has no impressor, what that means is that there is no external body that causes it, no? But then I don't distinguish between bodily and non-bodily impressors, and I don't distinguish that is true from cases where there is no impressor at all, but it's still caused by the mind. No? Yes, okay. I need to think more about this. Thanks a lot.
Please. Sorry. I don't think. Can you hear me? Michele, Alessandrelli. No?
Your audio is...
Yes, thank you. Yes, please.
It was first Jean-Baptiste.
No, I think you were first.
Yeah, I think so too. Sorry.
Yes.
If you want, I can speak before you.
I go. Thank you. Thank you, Ricardo. I have two questions. And the first one regards the distinction between Fantaston and Phantasma. Fantaston is a verbal adjective, which means that we are dealing with an object that is certainly independent of us, an object that is a possible object of fantasia, in that it can arouse in us the fantasia that Fantaston as its object, that has as its object the object that causes it. Phantasma, on the other hand, with its ending in ma, it is a nomen reacte, it is the result. So we could also say the product of a fantasia. If a difference between Fantaston and Phantasma is not the difference between what is independent of the mind and what is dependent of the mind as a product of the mind, I do not believe that this difference would have been articulated in the lexical terms in which it was articulated. And if it is true that there are no explicit statements in the sources, you are right on this, Ricardo, on the status of phantasmata as mental constructs, it is perhaps one of the points that the lexical distinction between Fantaston and Phantasma wanted to capture. It is one thing to say that a fantasia is a fantasia of an object that did not cause it. And quite another to say that a fantasia is a fantasia of an object that is, it had caused it, but in reality did not cause it. In other words, it seems to me that in Aetius, Chrysippus' point is that when we have a fantasticon, we actually believe, mistakenly, that we have a fantasia.
Yeah?
The second question regards the anti-Platonic stance of Zeno. If Zeno is a realist in matter of concepts, in what consists his anti-Platonic stance? The only difference between Platonic ideas and Zenonian concepts relies in the fact that the Platonic ideas have existence, the einai, and whereas the Zenonian universals have a hypostasis. I think that this is an important point on which I want your reply. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Michele. Well, regarding your first question, I'm not sure if I understood it well, but think, for example, of the case of Dion, when I have a dream of Dion, right? So I dream of Dion. Dion is not the impressor of the dream, but still I dream of him, and it is a phantasma, no? The text doesn't say it is a phantasma, that he is a phantasma, but the language that is used to describe him and the dream is the language used in IIFs to describe the fantasia, no? The fantasticon, no? And the phantasma. So in the case of Dion, I mean, he's a real object, you know, but he's not the impressor of the mental state. So so he's a phantasma. So I think we need to think about these kind of cases, no, where there is a distinction. I mean, yeah. So I think we need to think more about those cases, no, because they really show that the phantasma is not a mental construct, right? But I still have a mental representation of them. They are not the cause of the impression, no? But it doesn't follow from that they are mental construct. That's what I want to say. And regarding the second question, I mean, what's the position of Zeno regarding Plato? Well, the thing is that my impression, my fantasia is that I hope not my fantasticon, but my fantasia, my impression is that people tend to assume from the start that Zeno is a nominalist, no? So of course, if he that he's against Plato, and I mean, if that's true, then of course, I mean, what's his criticism to the Platonic theory of forms if universals are mind-independent entities? Of course, there's a problem there. But if you look at the evidence, I don't see that there is a criticism. No, I mean, there is a comparison between forms and enoemata. There is this passage by Aesius where he says that they are coextensive. No. The only criticism to Platonic forms, very strong, is in the utis argument. No, but that's an argument by Chrysippus. In the case of Chrysippus, I don't know what's my position. What I want to say about Chrysippus in the longer version of the paper is that that he's against the reality of universals, but it doesn't follow from that universals are mental constructs. So the conclusion I want to reach in the case of Chrysippus is very similar, no? Namely that the evidence that universals are mental constructs is not conclusive. But in the case of Chrysippus, you do have this argument where he says that enoemata, that universals are not something, no? They are utina. Whatever that means, it surely implies that they are not, that they do not fall under the supreme genus. That's true. But that's Chrysippus. I don't see that there is this kind of strong evidence in the case of Zeno.
Yes,
Yeah.
one point. In the case of Fantasia of Dion, in the Sextus text, the text says that we have a fantasticon, a diachenon, a chusmon, because we have fantasiae not of mere Dion, but of Dion parestotos, as present. And that's its phantasma, no? And is not a fantasia of something. It's a fantasia of Dion Zontos, but represented as present in the Bury translation, imagining that Dion is standing beside him when Dion is alive. And to this content, nothing corresponds. I'm not sure that we can say that to this content corresponds if the fact that Dion is alive. In this sense, the phantasma, it seems a mental product of a disturbed activity of imagination.
Yes, okay, fine. That's true. That's a subtlety in the text that I don't analyze. No, I mean, what is exactly the phantasma? Is it Dion, or is it the state of affairs that Dion is present? No, and but then the phantasma here would be a lecton, no, an axioma, no. Dion is present. I mean that would be, yeah. Yeah, that's true. I mean that if you're right, then this would fall. This second case would be a case similar to the case of Lecta, no? That we have impressions of Lecta. Yeah, yeah. Well, thanks a lot, Michele.
Thanks to you.
We have like 10 minutes and 2 more questions. So Jean-Baptiste and then Eduardo. So Jean-Baptiste, please.
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you for your paper, Ricardo. So I have my question is follows upon the second question of Michele. It's about the relationship to the Platonists, because it's your position is not completely clear to me, because one could say that in general universals are not figments for Zeno, but that universals in the sense of Plato are figments. And your position on this, I can't understand exactly what is your position on this. And one of the things that on your text 4c, immediately after your passage, there is a sentence which you have not printed and
Which passage? Which passage?
4c. Immediately in Stobe's text, there is a sentence that you have not reproduced, and which says that totas oistoikoi philosophoi facin anuparctus enai. Namely, they say that the ideas are non-existent, and I think this is this sentence, which you have not commented and reproduced, that is the basis of why many people usually think that the ideas, the Platonic ideas, are figments. And in general, I don't think that the idea that Platonic ideas are figments is the same idea as universals are figments. You see what I mean? That you can have the idea that universals are not figments, but that universals in the Platonic sense are figments. And so I would like to have a more clear idea as your views about that, and in particular, so about the next sentence, which you have not commented and not reproduced, and if I'm not mistaken, but it seems to me that you have not commented it. And you know, there is also a follow-up in the same sentence, and they say that, which is not obvious at all, that we participate in the enoemata metekain, enoemata, and we tunkanein, we bear the prosegoriae. So that's a very complicated issue, and I think maybe you should comment also that sentence and not in your final paper, because your position, I think, would be more substantial.
True. Question, Jean-Baptiste. I mean, the passage that I don't quote fully is T4C, T4C, right? T4C, or which one? The Stobeos, no?
Yes, that's T4C.
Sadly,
That's fragment 65 in Phononyme. For the
yes,
fragment.
yes.
And there is one more sentence that you don't comment.
Yes. Well, what I have to say about what I do quote from T4C is what I was telling Michele, no? That, I mean, the passage says they, Zenonian concepts, were called ideas by past philosophers, for ideas of things are of things that fall under concepts such as men, horses, and to speak more generally, all animals, and as many other things they say they are ideas of. So the point of this is just to explain what's the relation between Platonic forms and enoemata, and what the source is explaining is that they are coextensive. No? Mm-hmm. So the part of it that I don't quote is, sorry, let me find it. So yeah, well, but you were saying that it's not the same to call Platonic ideas figments and to call enoemata figments. What's the difference? I mean, is the meaning of the term
the
is more loaded?
It's not the same to say that universals are figments and that Platonic universals are figments. You see, because you could have the position that universals are not figments for Zeno, but that they are, but Platonic universals are figments. So that there is something which is wrong with Plato's views, which make them figments in the sense he can see them, but not, universals are not figments whatsoever.
Well, the evidence that we have for Zenonian universals being figments, right, is for example, T4A, no? The Stoic followers of Zeno asserted that Platonic, yes, I say. I mean, a passage like T4A, you would say that this passage, when not the Stoic followers of Zeno asserted that ideas, hoi apozenonos stoikoi enoemata gemetera tas ideas ephasan. Your point there is that he's saying that ideas are concepts, and the evidence for figments. No. Yes, I need to look more carefully at this, Jean-Baptiste, I think. No? for example, esti de noema fantasma dianoias logikuzou, no? A phantasma is no?
Because what make Platonic ideas figments is that Platon think they are choristas. And if you don't think they are choristas, then they are not figments.
I see. Okay. Let me think more about this. May I? And we can discuss it later.
Just a suggestion. And not only a suggestion,
About this, yeah.
only the fact that your views are not completely clear to me.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jean-Baptiste.
Thanks. Eduardo?
Yeah. So thank you very much, Ricardo, for your paper and for inviting me for this conference. Are you hearing me? That's right.
Yes.
You're here?
Yes.
Yeah. So it's a general question. My question basically has to do with the previous questions. It's about the non-Platonic stance of the Stoics, the general non-Platonic stance of position of the Stoics. So it's the famous paper, much quoted paper of Victor Caxton about the universals in the Stoics. Your paper basically agree with him. So he says that, if I'm not wrong, that there was Zeno, there was a conceptual realism in Zeno, and at the end of the paper, his general conclusion is that my question is that if you agree or not with his conclusion, is that Zeno basically he saved the realism of universals, of at least mildly, for the sake of saving human discourse. So the human discourse had some substantiality, had some value. It's somehow was substantial because universals were real. So somehow real, or mildly real. And he says that has to do with the next paper. Chrysippus basically canceled universals because he had electa. So electa replaced universals in Chrysippus theory, but for the same sake, for saving human discourse. Yeah, do you agree with that? That's my question.
Yes, well, I'm not sure if I would agree 100% with Caston, but yes, in general terms, as you put his position, I think I would. No, I think I would, at least in the sense that in Chrysippus we do have a clear denial of Platonism, no, and the exclusion of concepts and universals in general from the ontology, or at least from the highest genus, no? And I would also agree with this interpretation of Caston that Zeno is, I mean, he's a realist. But again, I'm not saying that Zeno is a realist because I'm not sure that the evidence for Zeno's realism is conclusive. No, I agree that the passages can be read either way. So my point is just the negative one, no? That we cannot be so sure about his nominalism, no? But yes, Caston, his position at the end of his paper is something that I think it's possible, certainly.
But for the sake of human discourse, for saving, that's, I mean, this general idea that
I think we would need more. I think we would need to think more about what is human discourse. But yes, that's the kind of thing that I think is possible. Yes. Yes.
Thanks for your questions, and thank you, Ricardo, for your paper. And well, we have a break now, right? Like 10 minutes? 10 minutes break? Well, thanks.